Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 for Topic 10, which covers Chapter 7. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at news media and the democracy. So what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to look at the role that the news media plays in a democratic society. And next we're going to look at, after we look at the role that the news media plays, we're going to take a look at whether or not there's any checks on the power of the media. So that's what we've got in the docket for this lecture. So let's get started. On the midterm exam, as you might recall, there was a question about which civil liberties do you think are essential for the maintenance of democracy? And a lot of you selected freedom of expression, freedom of speech as just a cornerstone of democratic society, and indeed it is. But many of you also chose freedom of the press as an important civil liberty that is necessary for a democratic society. Freedom of press and freedom of expression are very similar. They're both forms of expression. But freedom of the press is, as that quote says there, is perhaps one of the most visible manifestations of Americans exercising their expression. And that comes from the textbook Rights, Liberty, and Justice that I use for my civil liberties class. And it's true, you might hear people on the street corner in a park expressing themselves, but when you turn on the television and watch televised news, or the radio and listen to radio news, or open up your device and take a look at a news source, it's there where you're really seeing sort of this broad expression, this broad effort to inform people about what's going on in our country, in our cities, and in the world. And here are just some pictures that bring that all these different sort of manifestations of expression through the press to light. Here are three of the legacy newspapers that we have in the United States, have been reporting in the United States for in some cases, over 150 years, like with the New York Times. So we got the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Here is examples of both legacy news broadcasting, NBC, CBS News, ABC, Evening News, all of those, but new cable news, not that new anymore, but new entries into that. Frontline, some of you are in my criminal justice class, and so Frontline is an investigative news documentary series that's on PBS, and it's a good place to kind of get informed on sort of behind the scenes reporting on certain issues throughout the United States. And here are two classic investigative reporters who broke the Watergate story for the Washington Post. Carl Bernstein here, Bob Woodward here, and they're both continue to be investigative news journalists today. So earlier in the semester, we talked about how when you live in a democratic society, it's important that the citizenry is informed, knowledgeable, and active. And it's really hard and difficult to achieve those goals without a news media that is independent of government control. If the government is controlling what the newspaper publishes, then we're really not getting the facts about what the government is doing or what other social institutions are doing, because the government is controlling the output of information. And the framers of the Constitution were really acutely aware of the importance that not just freedom of speech, but the importance of freedom of the press plays in ensuring that we live in a democratic society that has knowledgeable and informed citizens at the helm. And so what the First Amendment says is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. That's what the First Amendment says. And how that's been interpreted by the United States Supreme Court is that that government cannot exercise prior restraint on the news media. In other words, that the government cannot ask, if they think that the news media is going to publish something that is damaging to them or damaging to national security or libel, they cannot tell the news media that they can't publish that news story until the government gives them the approval to publish it. That's what prior restraint is. It's like, oh, we hear that you're going to be writing a story about the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, but we're worried that that's going to be damaging to our national security. Let us take a look at that article before you publish it, and we'll give you the okay. If we don't give you the okay, you can't publish it. The Supreme Court, the First Amendment prohibits prior restraint. You cannot have prior restraint in the United States. In other words, government cannot block the publication of news prior to its release. Now, after the release, government could take action if, in fact, something is damaging to national security. And most news sources are not going to do that anyways. But prior to that, they cannot take action. The release of the Pentagon Papers is a good example of that. The Pentagon Papers were a study that was done by the Department of Defense about the Vietnam War. The papers were leaked, and the news media, the Washington Post and the New York Times, published excerpts of the Pentagon paper. And the government stepped in and says, nope, you cannot publish them. And if you do, you're going to get in trouble. And that case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, that the government cannot exercise that kind of prior restraint. And so keep in mind that the press is the only private entity that is explicitly granted protections of liberty in the Constitution. All of the other liberties are designed to protect individuals. The press is the only institution that is explicitly granted those protections from government intrusion in our Constitution. Okay, so let's look at the role that the news media plays in a democracy. And then we'll look at if there are any checks that are placed on the power of the news media. We'll do that in the second half of the lecture. And so in the role that the news media plays is that its role is to inform people, to serve as a watchdog, and to provide a public forum, all of which sort of fit into that broader notion about creating a knowledgeable and informed citizenry. So let's take a look at each of these individually. So in a democracy, it's important that people have the right to vote, universal suffrage. But it's also important that voters are informed and that they hold reasonable opinions as well, so that when they're going to actually cast a vote, that it is a reflection of really what the people want, because they're knowledgeable, they know what they want. And the news media provides necessary information, both to be informed about issues, but also to sort of analyze those issues and to begin to form reasoned opinions about particular issues. And so, let's take an example right now. That right now the Congress is trying to pass this very large spending bill. It's called the Build Back Better bill. And there's been a lot of debate on the floor of the Congress about whether or not they're going to actually be able to pass this bill. Well, as a voter, you might be interested in what is included in that bill. Well, can you figure out what's included in the bill? I guess you could find the bill and read it, but even the bill itself is just still being sort of added to and subtracted to, as it works its way through Congress. So the best way to find out about what's in that bill, to see whether or not it's something that you support, is to read about it, or listen to the news, or read about it in a newspaper or online. Because it's there that's where you're going to find the necessary information that you need in order to know about what's in that bill. And why do you need to know that as a voter? Well, let's say that bill gets passed. One thing you might want to know is, how is that bill going to impact me? One of the things that bill does is that it expands kindergarten, so that it provides universal kindergarten. They haven't passed it yet, so hopefully it'll still be in the bill, or not, depending on what your stand on it is. But that it would allow 4-year-olds and up to go to pre-K, pre-kindergarten. And so, would that affect you? Well, how you would find out and be informed about that is you would read about it in the news media. But also, there's a midterm election coming up in 2022. Maybe you really like this bill and when it gets passed into law. Well, how do you know whether you like it or not? Well, you'll read about it and you'll see whether or not you think that this is a good use of taxpayer dollars. Also, whether or not it's achieving its goals in terms of its public policy. Or you might read about it and be like, this is horrible. It's way too much spending. It's not achieving any goals. You learn about that to get an informed and reasoned opinion about who you want to vote for, particularly if they did or did not support that bill. You get that from the news media. I grew up in the Chicago area, and our public television station was Channel 11, and it was WTTW. And it stood for Window to the World. Because when we talk about the informing role of the news media, their role is to provide basically a window to the world, because we can't be on the floor of Congress to see what's going on. We can't be in Afghanistan to look at how the withdrawal of troops is going, and the impact that had on the Afghan citizens. We can't be down in Racine. I guess you could, but to see how the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse is going. Right, the closing arguments are today. And so we rely on the news media to inform us, to provide that window. In other words, to hold up a mirror of the world and report out objectively on what is going on. So that is that one key component of the media informing people. But the media also provides analysis of what's going on. And so on the one hand, they hold a mirror up and do objective reporting. But if you look in newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post, they'll provide analysis of that, and they'll label it news analysis. And it allows you to sort of think critically about the news event. And then you can also get perspectives through op-eds, opinion editorials, where people are basically weighing in and saying, well, this is why we think the Build Back Better law is bad or why it's good. And that can help you develop a reasoned opinion about that bill. And so the role here of the news media is that with this information analysis, people can cast informed votes and be knowledgeable about issues. So one major role that the news media plays in a democracy. Another role that the news media plays in a democracy is that the news media serves as a watchdog. And what does that mean? Well, one of the things that the news media does is that it scrutinizes or investigates the actions of elected officials and other public officials, those who are not elected, and also investigates the activities of non-public figures, such as priests, and I'll give a concrete example of that in a second, and also just social institutions as well, like businesses. And, and so the news media, using their watchdog function, using their investigative journalism skills, will investigate the actions of elected and non-elected officials and companies and businesses in the United States. And then they basically, through their reporting, hope to hold those people accountable, particularly if they've engaged in illegal actions. When the news media serves as a watchdog, it's oftentimes referred to as the fourth estate. And what does that mean? Well, in the United States, we have the separation of powers. The power is separated into three branches of government, and those are oftentimes sort of like referred to not contemporarily, but historically as like estates. The legislative, the executive, the judiciary are the three estates. And they're seen as necessary components for the smooth functioning of a democracy. And we know that, while each of those branches have specific powers, that their power is not likely to be abused because they have to, work with the other branches, and those other branches provide some oversight of the activities of, the different branches. And so the fourth estate, or the news media, is oftentimes seen as an additional check on the power of government and institutions within society as well. And so that if you want to have a smooth functioning democracy, not only does government need to provide oversight itself, but you need to have a non-governmental organization like the news media that's actually providing some watchdog function and pointing out the abuse of power when it happens in government and beyond. Some examples of the news media acting as the fourth estate using their investigative watchdog powers. Here's a few. The Washington Post. On the previous slide, I showed you the pictures of Woodward and Bernstein. They were they broke the Watergate story that brought down the President Nixon in the 1970s. What Nixon did is that he was behind basically the hiring of a group of people, burglars, who burglarized the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate office buildings, and that they were hired in order to get information that would help the President Nixon get reelected in when he ran for re-election in 1972. Well, Woodward and Bernstein uncovered that conspiracy and showed that it led all the way to the top with President Nixon, and that led to President Nixon's resignation. More recently, the Washington Post has been doing investigations on the opioid crisis in the United States, and in particular, the role that Purdue Pharma has played in the opioid crisis. If any of you are watching the great show on Hulu called Dopesick, it's based on a book about the opioid crisis. A lot of the reporting that goes on in that Dopesick and other documentaries, that's not a documentary, but documentaries about the opioid crisis are based on investigative reporting that the Washington Post did in a series that they started in 2016 called the Opioid Files. And then a final example is the New York Times working with the New Yorker magazine that investigated Harvey Weinstein, the head of the movie producer, and that basically reported on not just his sexual harassment, but his sexual assault, and that he is now serving time in prison because of that investigative reporting. And so it's through investigative reporting that people got the information that they need, not just to make decisions at the ballot box about what issues they support, but also it gives us information so that we can hold accountable those who are leading us in elected office, but also demanding that our elected officials hold accountable individuals that non-public individuals, businesses, non-governmental institutions that are violating the law. We know about it. We can hold our elected officials accountable, say, you better do something about that. So all of those are good examples of that watchdog role that the news media plays. There have been lots of great movies that have focused on the watchdog function of the news media, and I'll just put 3 of them up here if you're interested. The oldest one is the middle one, All the President's Men. All the President's Men is based on the book that Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward wrote about their experience in uncovering and investigating the Watergate scandal. And it's a great movie from the 1970s that stars Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. So check that out. More recent ones, The Spotlight is a great movie that is about the Boston Globe's investigation of the Boston Catholic Diocese. So basically the priest abuse scandal, and that was uncovered by the investigative arm of the Boston Globe called The Spotlight. And then The Post with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep is a great movie that takes a look at the investigatory journalism around the Pentagon Papers. I highly recommend all 3 of these movies if you are interested. The last role that we're going to talk about is that the news media serves as a public forum. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of all the roles that the news media plays in a democracy. So not only does the news media inform the people, but it also provides the people an opportunity to debate political issues and policies. In other words, it gives people a public forum to debate issues, and that because it's broadcast or shown on TV, whatever, gives other people an opportunity to learn from those public forums. Candidate debates are a good example of that. Town hall meetings are oftentimes broadcast, or sometimes news media organizations like CNN will host a town hall on a particular issue. And also it serves as a public forum because the news media will cover social movements like Black Lives Matter, right? And so that you can learn about the topics and the issues of concern of social movements, because the news media will report that, and then the social movements will use the news media, because they have access to it, as a way of debating issues and bringing those issues to into the minds of the people that are able to watch that news coverage. So the news media has a lot of power. They have the power to inform people. They have the power to investigate elected and non-elected officials. And if they're doing their job right, that they are fact-based in their reporting and fact-based in their investigations, then they're a benefit to democracy. However, if the news media is not fact-based, if it's spreading misinformation, if it's biased in the investigations that it's doing, that can be very harmful to democracy as well. And so the question are there any checks on the power of the news media? Well, by law, there are very few checks on the power of the news media. The press is protected by the First Amendment. And so that, particularly the print media, and that would include print media that then is published on the internet, because the internet also gets a lot of robust First Amendment protections. There is not a lot of check on that power. That it's not without limits. After a news, if a news source is publishing pornography, that's outside of First Amendment protections. If the press is publishes something that is damaging and harmful to like national security, at that point the government can step in. And so, but before publication, there really aren't many checks on the power, as there probably shouldn't be, right? Because you don't want the government, curtailing the job of the news media. So by law, very few. The Federal Communication Commission, the FCC, as you'll read about in the textbook, it does have the capacity to place regulations on broadcast media via licenses. And so the treatment of broadcast media, such as televised media, news media, and radio broadcasts, those do have more laws regulating them, because the idea is that they're using like these public airwaves, and that therefore people can be exposed to things on the radio or the television. And so the government has a greater interest in kind of regulating what is being broadcast. And so they do have obscenity guidelines, and you'll read about sort of the equal time clause. We used to have this thing called the fairness doctrine. So the FCC does have these regulations in place on broadcast media. But the thing is most media is not really considered broadcast anymore, right? That cable news is not broadcast. It comes through the cable. That's not subject to FCC regulations. That we have satellite radio. So there's not a lot of broadcast news. So even though the FCC does have this power to regulate, it doesn't have, and the regulation that it does not have very strong teeth, and it doesn't apply to a lot of the news organizations that we have today in the United States. Okay, so the law itself is somewhat limited in terms of the checks that it can place on the power of the news media, in particular because of the First Amendment. And so are there any other checks on the power of the news media? Well, we'll take a look at two. The first one that we're going to take a look at is journalistic standards. Journalists are professionals, and most journalists are professionals, and that they go to journalism school and they learn the standards that are identified as the high quality standards that all good journalists should use. And that's oftentimes referred to as hard news reporting. And we'll take a look at what hard news reporting is in a moment. But hard news reporting is basically the gold standard in terms of the journalistic standards that journalists should use. And if journalists aren't, guided by the hard news reporting standard, then it's the editor's job to basically hold the journalists accountable. If they're not using these standards, then the editors of newsrooms will then say, look, we're not going to publish what you're writing because it has not lived up to these standards, right? If you watch All the President's Men, you basically look at the editor of the newspaper is coming in and basically like not publishing what Woodward and Bernstein found until they were able to get proper and legitimate sourcing for the reporting that they were doing. And so editors are supposed to hold journalists to these standards, and then owners of newspapers are supposed to hold editors and journalists to these standards. This is sort of the ideal world, and in a second we're going to talk about how this doesn't always play itself out. But when you talk about hard news reporting, like what do we mean by that? What is the standard? Well, the standard is that journalists are supposed to seek they seek to report the truth via fact checking, and so they base their reporting on facts, and that they double check the fact you know, the facts that they are finding to support the reporting that they're doing. They verify those with sources to make sure that what they're finding and what they think is the truth is verified by not just themselves, but by other reliable sources, and that they use those same standards for any kind of reporting that they're doing, in particular investigative reporting. They also use legitimate sources to report factual claims, and so that if a news journalist thinks something is true and based on fact, they're going to get sources to corroborate those facts. And if they cannot get reliable sources to corroborate those facts, then they will not print it. And also they try to balance coverage of events through the objective treatment of opposing sides. So a lot of times, with the hard news reporting standard, if you're writing about like Purdue Pharma, you would contact Purdue Pharma and say, this is what we're planning on writing about you. What is your response to it, so that we can report how you would respond to these claims that we or other sources that we're using are making, and so that you present those viewpoints in as objectively as possible. And so that is a check that there's a standard that's supposed to be used. Journalists are supposed to use it, and if they don't use it, then the editorial team holds those people responsible. But that consumers of the news can hold journalists responsible and news sources responsible if they don't feel like that they're living up to these values as well. And that brings us to the last source or check of power on the news media that we're going to talk about. And that, just as I said on the last slide, that consumers can hold news organizations responsible if they don't feel like they're doing objective news reporting. That's basically the marketplace, right? The marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of the press. So the news media in the United States is privately owned for the most part. We don't have a lot of publicly owned media, and even something like National Public Radio or public broadcasting, it may get a very small percentage of its funding from the government. Most of the funding that they get is from listeners, people who listen to it. They'll donate money, fund drives, if you ever listen to NPR, right? And so, in order to ensure that our news media isn't controlled by the government, they're privately owned businesses. They're owned by families sometimes, like the Washington Post was for a while. Now the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon. They're oftentimes owned by corporations. You'll read about this in your textbook, that own like mega corporations that own many things, not just news sources. And so it's a privately owned business, and that as a privately owned business, they need to make money. They need revenue to survive. Well, you might be like, how is that serving as a check on the power of the news media? Well, they need consumers to subscribe to survive. They need either people to listen to their news broadcasts on cable news, and that more listeners, more watchers, more eyes. More people are going to see ads, so they get ad revenue. Same with broadcasts on radio, selling ads generates money. And for a lot of newspapers these days, that they get their money from subscribers. If you want to read the New York Times, every day, you got to subscribe to it. You get a couple news articles a month. But if you want to actually read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, a lot of magazines, you've got to subscribe to it. So in a way, that the market can serve as a check on the power of the news media. If the product fails to live up to journalistic standards, they're going to lose their readership, right? If you feel like you're reading the New York Times and they're not doing a good job, that they're not fact checking, that when others look at the reporting that the New York Times is doing and they're saying it's filled with flaws and misinformation, well, they're going to stop subscribing to it. At least that's how it works in theory. However, as we know, good journalism, hardcore journalism, hard reporting doesn't always sell, right? A lot of times I hear students say, I don't watch the news media because it's boring as F, right? Well, yeah, hard news reporting is boring as F, right? It should be, because it's supposed to be objective. So we know that it doesn't always sell. But since news media organizations are owned and out to make a profit, they've got to make sure that eyes are watching them and that clickbait, that people are clicking on your website. And so sensationalism, breaking news, that's oftentimes what drives people to tune in and to watch. And that doesn't necessarily serve as a check. It doesn't guarantee that good news reporting is going to thrive, because people may not be turning into that. And what they might be tuning onto is the sensational misinformation. It's also possible that consumers just don't really care about facts, right? I think about that a lot today when I think about like the health of our democracy. People don't necessarily want to know what's true. They want to know what they believe to be true to be reinforced, right? And the textbook talks about that selection bias, getting in your ideological filter bubble. You only want to read information that corresponds with what you believe to be true. That doesn't serve as a check on how can you check the media if people don't care whether certain news sources are publishing facts? They just want to hear what they believe to be true. So the market's limited in that way. So maybe the market is not really providing correct incentives to place checks on the power of the media. If it's a news source that's ideological, they know, hey, we don't have to report the news because we know that our libs or our conservatives are always going to tune in. And if it's sensationalism, it's like, hey, we're not going to actually cover the news that matters, but we're just going to cover, the one more gruesome crime, or, the one more sensational, like Hollywood event or whatever. So the marketplace obviously is limited in terms of the powers that it places on a check, is limited in terms of the checks on the power that it places on the media. So in conclusion, when thinking about the role of the news media and the role that it plays in a democracy, how would you evaluate the job the news media is doing? Do you feel like they do a good job informing you, on investigating, providing a meaningful public forum for debate? Do you feel like are there news sources that you confidently rely upon because you feel like their news reporting is objective and fact-based? Or do you feel like that you have a hard time finding news media that you can trust? If you do, find news media that you feel like does a good job with fact-based reporting, do you consume that media? I know it's hard as struggling college students to subscribe to news media content, because it can be expensive, it can add up. But as you move on in your life and you have more money, if there's news sources that you rely on that you think is doing excellent hard fact-based journalism, try to subscribe to them, because then that way we can make the marketplace work. On the flip side of that, if you feel like there's a media source that is failing and is not doing fact-based reporting, do you stop consuming it? And then, do you trust the news media? Trust in the news people is really high right now. According to Gallup, 34% of Americans report having, when it comes to trusting the news media, they say that they don't trust it at all. 34%. And that's not surprising when you look at the rhetoric about fake news and just this widespread sort of assumption that all news media is corrupt in a way. And so, what do you think about, do you trust the news media? Is there some news media that you trust and others that you don't trust? And if you don't trust news media, do you turn it off? Or do you feel like I just can't trust news at all? And maybe think about when you have that level of distrust in the news media, and also the promotion of the viewpoint that you can't trust the news, right? That we have some public officials that promote that kind of distrust. Maybe think about the negative impact that has on the democracy, particularly if there are reliable news sources that you can depend on. All right, thanks a lot. And in the next video, the next lecture, we're going to be talking about different sources of news, and also thinking critically about how to consume online news sources.